This program contains graphic material, including offensive language. Viewer discretion is advised.
There's a certain number of individuals that just cannot fit into society.
The combination of the two personalities is what escalated it.
Murder meant that they were closer and closer together, bonded by murder.
Michael was the angel of death. He was the one that she used to kill, but she was the one giving the commands.
Together, I think they were like dynamite in a match. She was definitely the match.
On March the 6th, 1981, San Francisco police received a frantic call from the owner of an apartment building.
The landlord had a plumber, and they were checking out the basement, and they happened to go into the basement apartment, and they found Karen Barnes lying in the kitchen.
The 23-year-old victim was lying face down in a pool of blood.
She had a blanket covering her. She had numerous stab wounds on her neck and the side of her face. She had blunt trauma about the head. So my first reaction is there's a dead body, and you're trying to find out who did it.
There was no evidence of forced entry.
She had money in her purse, and it appears that she was not raped. Karen sustained several blows to the head, causing the skull to be crushed. And the coroner examined the iron skillet in the kitchen cabinet, and he indicated to me that he thought this might be one of the murder weapons. She had approximately 12 or 13 stab wounds to the neck and to the face.
But there was no sign of the knife. There were few clues in the sparse apartment. In the living room, police noticed that the walls were painted with mysterious religious symbols and a name, Suzanne. As the murder investigation got underway, Karen's friends were interviewed. Police discovered that a month earlier, a couple had moved into Karen's home. The pair were described as drug-dealing hippies.
Karen's friends gave us the name of Michael and Suzanne Bear. However, after speaking with Karen's mother, she informed us that their true names were Michael and Suzanne Carson.
Karen had met the couple at a party in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco's former hippie district. They became immediate friends.
Karen Barnes was a vulnerable young woman who was attracted to interesting, unusual things. Suzanne and Michael Carson were kind of interesting. They were talking about meditation and psychic behavior. Well, Karen was always interested in that. And so she found out, oh, they were looking for a place to stay. She said, well, you can stay with me.
Michael and Suzanne practiced their own interpretation of the Muslim religion. Karen was fascinated and was slowly drawn into their way of thinking. But since the murder, there was no sign of the couple who had shared Karen's home. The more investigators uncovered, the more crucial it became to find them.
When people met Suzanne and Michael Carson, they were horrified by them. These people were dangerous. They sent off dangerous vibes.
The couple didn't have a criminal record. There was no evidence to suggest they were killers.
They were persons of interest. They weren't suspects, but they were persons of interest. You just don't put out an all points bulletin because they would match everybody on the street. We were looking into other avenues of other crimes in the area to see if they matched Karen's.
Suzanne Bear Carson was born in Arizona in 1941.
She lived an idyllic childhood. Her father was a newspaper executive and her mother was a stay-at-home mother. She had all the benefits of growing up in that sort of privilege in Arizona.
But as she was growing up, Suzanne seemed to lose interest in other people.
She thought she was psychic. Even when she was a child, she was psychic. And that sort of separated her from everyone else.
She had few friends and didn't perform well at school.
She met a man just a few years older than her and not really fitting in. She ended up married. She went on to live a life very similar to the one that she'd grown up in.
But things soon changed. Suzanne became disillusioned and began to search for other meaning in her life. She embraced the counterculture and its philosophy of free love, mind-altering drugs, and spirituality. She also developed a radical interpretation of the Islamic religion.
As sort of a statement about her newfound identity, Susan changed her name from Susan with an S to Susan with a Z. She was sort of writing her own version of Islamic religion. She was following Allah, but she was writing a script that fit her needs too.
It was simply a religion for her that was convenient, where she could take parts of that religion and sort of mix them together with her own personal delusions.
Yeah, right.
Ultimately, her husband couldn't take that anymore. She had rebelled against him, so they ended up divorced.
With her newfound freedom, Suzanne completely reinvented herself and reinterpreted the world to suit her needs.
She was going in a certain direction, and she felt she had a different destiny. She was looking for somebody. She knew she was destined for someone else. She said that when she was 35, it was as if she had been touched by something. Maybe it was the drugs, maybe it was the mescaline, maybe it was the acid that she took. But she said that all of a sudden she changed. She started having visions.
And those visions called for a spiritual partner to complete her destiny.
Susan needed to have someone follow her. She needed someone who would do her bidding. She needed someone to be with her forever, her eternal soulmate.
San Francisco, 1981. Karen Barnes had been brutally murdered. Michael and Suzanne Bear Carson, who had lived with the victim, had vanished. The pair were inseparably bound by their unusual religious beliefs.
From Susan's perspective, it is a combination of her delusions, which she has embraced, certain very specific delusions, coupled with her need to control somebody else, where she will have them totally under her power. And using those delusions, she was able to attract someone to her. And Michael was that guy.
Michael Bear Carson was born James Carson in 1950 in Oklahoma.
He was born to a loving middle-class family. His father was an oil engineer for an oil company. Mom was a school teacher. So just very typical family. But he was diagnosed with a rare bone disorder very young. And he was actually put on bed rest for several years. And he just threw himself into books and reading. He had a great love early on of philosophy, religion, politics, history.
But Carson also developed a defiant nature.
He was very much a rebel, involved with drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and did not want to conform to that late 1950s, early 60s.
In the late 1960s, he studied at the University of Iowa. He met a woman called Lynn, who shared his political interests. They married in the second year, and after graduation, the couple had a child, Jen. In 1975, the family moved to Arizona.
My mother was teaching English, and my father was a stay-at-home dad / pot dealer. Read to me and took me to the petting zoo and made me breakfast every morning and braided my hair. And I have very, very fond memories of that time.
But the good times were short-lived.
I think he felt kind of lost. He was no longer immersed in that college environment. And so he just kind of jumped from one thing to another, just constantly looking for something to believe in.
Carson slowly started exhibiting antisocial tendencies.
He didn't get along with anybody. He hated the government. He was searching for God. He was angry. I don't know what the cause of his anger was, but he had an explosive personality.
He grew increasingly unstable, and his wife eventually lost patience.
There were a lot of arguments at that time. They would argue about my father's lack of, career. They'd also argue about his bizarre behavior.
In 1977, after 8 years of marriage, Michael and Lynn Carson divorced. Shortly afterwards, Michael met Suzanne.
The second they met, it was like fireworks. They were just almost instantaneously obsessed with each other.
Well, Michael was searching for God. Suzanne was searching for something, she didn't know what. And when they met, it was like two star-crossed lovers. It was magic.
He was a decade younger than her. He made her feel like she was beautiful and very sexual again.
But their attraction went far deeper.
She saw herself as intellectually superior, and by attaching herself to someone who was so well educated, I believe she felt that became a reflection of who she was. They were participating in hallucinogenics and pot and drinking on a daily basis. He was just an open door for all of her belief systems.
It was almost like one of these philosophers he'd read on a page. It just jumped off the page in 3 dimensions.
Susan provides him everything that he's looking for. Excitement, thrill, a new way of looking at the world, secrecy, all the things that he wants, and someone who understands him.
Suzanne had finally found her soulmate. Michael immediately moved in with her.
She was looking for a follower, and she found that in Michael. Michael was looking for someone to guide him.
Suzanne even changed his name.
The first night that Suzanne meets James Carson, she says, "Isn't your name Michael?" And she says, "No, darling, my name is James Carson." She said, "No, it's Michael. It's an angel in the Bible that fights the devil." And from that moment on, his name was Michael Carson.
And by having him change his name, he was showing her submission and also was willing to give up his past and be her follower.
They went traveling in search of spiritual enlightenment and started using Bear as their surname.
My father had an early fascination with bears. I think all children have different animals they love, so he just loved bears.
Michael and Suzanne Bear returned to the US in 1980, having adopted more beliefs.
They considered themselves vegan, Muslim warriors for God. They were just really kind of creating a two-person cult.
They just bastardized the religion. They picked and chose what they wanted to. I mean, they would be executed in a Muslim country. They were drug dealers. They were not Muslims.
They planned a new life in California and moved to San Francisco's infamous Haight-Ashbury district. They sold drugs and lived a nomadic lifestyle.
The word most people describe of them in this period were just freaks.
Michael said, "Okay, I'm a Hashashin," which is a kind of a sect that would smoke hash and then go kill their enemies. They picked out the Hashashin element of the Muslim religion because they wanted to kill witches. They thought they were on a mission to kill witches.
This was very off-putting to people, so I think they were looking for recruits.
They met young Karen Barnes at a party. She was fascinated by their strange beliefs.
She was kind of a groupie. Then she met the Carsons, and she said, "Oh, these people are interesting."
Suzanne and Michael moved into Karen's basement apartment. The cult of two became a cult of three, but not for long.
Suzanne began to claim that the people that she felt intimidated by were witches and other demons out to destroy her and Michael.
She decided Karen must die.
She was a threat to Susan. A threat because she was attractive, she was young. Susan felt that she was a threat to the relationship she had with Michael.
Suzanne convinced Michael that Karen was a witch. In 1981, San Francisco police were searching for Karen Barnes's killer. The pathology report confirmed that Karen had died from a fractured skull after being bludgeoned several times with a skillet. She had also suffered 13 stab wounds to her face and neck, inflicted from a paring knife. 2 of the wounds were deep enough to have been fatal. Investigators tried to find out more about the couple who had moved in with Karen, but the hunt ended in frustration.
After all leads were exhausted, The case was put aside. Still an active case, still an open case, but there were other cases that we were assigned that needed attention.
After Suzanne and Michael killed Karen, they fled San Francisco. They were tied together from that point on. They had started on a journey. There was no going back.
On March the 23rd, 2 weeks after the murder, Suzanne and Michael arrived in southern Oregon. They hid in a small mountain shack, which they called Allah's Mountain.
Allah's Mountain was paradise to Suzanne and Michael. It was a paradise with tall trees and a beautiful cabin where they could be together forever and grow all the dope they wanted to. In reality, it was a terrible, hideous shack.
They called themselves Muslim assassins, and they prepared to wage a jihad against witches and evildoers.
Karen was the first. Now they were going on. They were going to kill as many witches as they could.
But Suzanne had another motive.
Susan was very afraid of losing Michael. She had wrapped her world around him, her religion, and this belief system. And outside of that, there was no place for her to go.
She wants to kill anything that might threaten her relationship with Michael. Anything that might be intrusive in that relationship, she's going to destroy it.
After several months of hiding in the cabin, they ran out of food and drugs. Michael hitchhiked to LA to look for supplies, while Suzanne stayed behind in Oregon. When Michael returned a few weeks later, Suzanne was starving and delusional. Her visions revealed witches everywhere.
So there was no rhyme or reason to who Susan depicted as evil or threatening or a potential witch.
When a ranger evicted them from the cabin, they headed south and stayed on the move to avoid capture. On May the 22nd, 1981, they hitched a ride. The driver let Suzanne and Michael stay in a treehouse on some land he owned in the Ventana wilderness. A few days later, he regretted his decision.
Susan developed this almost manic smile or laugh, and she would laugh or smile in the most inappropriate moments. So even their manner of speech and so on were becoming very, very bizarre. And so I think people just were finding them to be off-putting.
When the man ordered them to leave, Suzanne and Michael took their revenge.
Suzanne says, you need to confront that person. We can't be thrown out of this place like this.
They robbed his house.
Suzanne said, Michael, here is your reward for earning your wings, being an angel of Allah. Here's a gun. Allah wants you to have a gun.
After setting fire to the house, they took off again and headed north to Humboldt County, California. In May 1982, a year after Karen's murder, Michael and Suzanne found jobs on a marijuana plantation.
The pot farm was located in a really rural area, just one dirt road into it. It was just heavily wooded with little areas cleared where they stored their pot growing supplies.
Suzanne and Michael hoped to blend into the secluded outlaw community.
The pot farmers told me that they didn't like Michael and Susan much because they were, in their words, kind of loony, kind of crazy folks. They professed to be anarchists. They were kind of constantly bickering about how to properly manicure the marijuana, and they were always doing some kind of drug.
Michael soon made an enemy.
Clark Stevens was a friend of the owner of the pot garden who had been invited up to come and help out. Immediately when he got there, he kind of knocked heads with Michael and Susan.
It began with an argument over how to tend to the plants, and quickly escalated.
Clark was the kind of guy that used foul language a little bit. He would get mad and say things to Susan that she felt were a violation of their Muslim religion. In their version of the religion, disrespect to females is almost like raping them. So then it would be up to Michael to avenge that transgression.
And he touched me. I need to take care of him.
But Susan ordered Michael to take care of it.
A few days later, while guarding the crops, Michael carried out Suzanne's instructions. On May the 17th, 1982, police received a strange call from the plantation.
One of the dogs in this marijuana growing area had been seen playing with a ball. So they looked closer and come to find out it was a human skull.
The police responded quickly.
As we started walking up the skid road towards where we were told the body was, you could smell it very strongly. The body had been burned, had kerosene poured on it, and then it had been lit on fire, and when it didn't burn properly, then they covered it with chicken manure, which they had there for the marijuana, as fertilizer for the marijuana.
Police carefully sifted through the remains.
We could see some bones sticking up. And then, underneath where a lot of the bones were, we found his wallet. And so we had his ID, we had his picture and his name.
The post-mortem confirmed the victim's identity. A bullet fired from a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson was also recovered. Clark Stevens had been found. Once again, Michael and Suzanne Carson had vanished.
I think they're mean people. They have no soul.
After Suzanne and Michael killed Clark Stevens, they headed down the highway.
They escaped to Trinity County, California. The following day, they panicked when they encountered the county sheriff's search and rescue team who were looking for a lost hiker.
Michael and Suzanne thought that they were after them for the murder, so they dropped their packs and bolted down the hill. They thought the police were hot on their trail. They weren't. Michael went towards LA. Suzanne went deep into the forest.
When the deputies searched the abandoned packs, they found the marijuana, bullets, an ID for a ᴄrＳᴢᴏ and a manuscript titled Cry for War. The manuscript was an anarchist's battle cry.
There's a whole culture of folks out there that hate the government, hate the people. Killing doesn't mean anything to them as long as they're justified in their own personal feeling.
Michael Bear had written Cry for War. It featured a hit list of prominent figures.
They felt that God wanted them to kill Ronald Reagan and Johnny Carson because their first, middle, and last names had 6 letters, 666. They were kind of connecting it to a religious or philosophic belief.
Police learnt that ᴄrSᴢᴏ's ID, found in the backpack, had been stolen months earlier. A computer check revealed that Michael Bear was wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Clark Stevens. Investigators took fingerprints from the manifesto and checked them against their database.
Because once you put it in the computer, law enforcement takes a look at it. And Secret Service picked up on that. Hey, these are threats to government officials.
Meanwhile, Michael made his way to the Alhambra area of LA. There, he was mistaken for someone else.
He looked like a rape suspect they were after. And so the Alhambra officer picks him up.
Michael still had the gun he'd used to kill Clark Stevens. He resisted the temptation to use it.
He laid Michael out on the street and patted him down, but he was carrying the gun in his crotch, and the officer didn't find the gun.
When the officer took him in for questioning, Michael hid the weapon under the back seat of the patrol car. Police questioned him for an hour. He gave them the name from the stolen ID. The police didn't check the narcotics database and were unaware that he was using someone else's identity.
It was simply because they had a miscommunication. Somehow, they didn't get the information that we wanted as a person of interest in a homicide.
Michael hoped his cover wouldn't be blown.
So they took his picture and had him fill out some paperwork, a felony sheet.
They faxed the photograph of Michael to the rape victim in the hospital.
And they said, no, that's not him. So they cut him loose. When they did that, when the next shift came on, their new officer, he pulls the back seat of his patrol car like you're supposed to do, and he finds a gun there.
After finding the gun, they put out an all-points bulletin to locate him. They used the name he'd given them, ᴄrSᴢᴏ. Police in Humboldt County recognized the name. The plantation workers and search and rescue team then identified Michael Bear Carson's picture.
We had the gun, we looked at the picture, looked like our guy. We sent the gun to the lab. We discovered that it matched a round that was taken out of the head of Clark Stevens. The ballistically was a match, so that pretty well convinced us that we had the right folks.
1 week after Clark Stevens' body was discovered, the killers were reunited.
Suzanne and Michael Carson met in Sonora at a place called Phoenix Lake Road because that was their prearranged meeting place if they got separated.
Suzanne's erratic visions then led them all over the state for months.
Although her cult was a person of one, she was using her religion to scare Michael into staying with her, intimidate him.
They eventually ended up in Portland, Oregon at a friend's house. Once again, they overstayed their welcome and were asked to leave. They took off, with Michael having stolen a .38 caliber pistol.
They were stranded out in the middle of the